Hello, my name is Excel Biology, and the topic of my research is linguistic identity. Um, my overall topic was performing her linguistic identity because the participant who I interviewed was a female and uses she, her pronouns, and I believe this was just a perfect way to sum it all together, the way she performs her linguistic identity. And my research question was, how does a Mexican/Spanish speaking American perform her linguistic identity in an English dominant society? My participant was Mexican, and I just want to know, how does she deal with having been bilingual in an English dominant society in the United States? In terms of intercultural communication, I believe this is relevant because it brings up the topic of racism in the United States, especially because she speaks another language. She might have an accent to others, which doesn't fit the ideal way to speak the language, as people might say in the United States. There's also racism physically, like she looks like a stereotypical Mexican American, which could lead to her being racially profiled in public. I just want to know, how was she able to perform all of this in such a English dominant society? I wanted to also talk about ethnocentrism. This is just about learning about her culture and her identity, and just being able to step outside of my culture and understand her and her culture as a whole. Identity, this touches on linguistic identity, racial identity, and in terms of learning about intercultural communication, by understanding someone's identity and learning more about it, we're able to better communicate with them and better understand who they are and understand what their culture is. It also brings awareness to issues that she might face in society today, and how that impacts herself, and how we can understand that better. Also, this is educational in the sense that I'm able to learn about how her culture, her identity, and just educate myself on things I may or may not have known before. So in intercultural communication, all of these are important, and I believe this topic really covers these things in ICC. In terms of literature, we picked 3 articles used in the course. First was Linguistic Assertiveness in Context Minoritization by Belmar Guinness. I think this brought up a good point about how switching to different language, a certain language dominant society, language minoritization, and just so many things that linguistic identity is related to. Also, Language Inequality and Interculturality by Thorndle brings up language exoticization, and just how certain societies will portray certain languages being just so unique, and why tourists should come see the locals of this area. Also, two-way integration by Lance was really important for my project because it talked about how being multilingual can be seen as a deficit, but also it can be seen as a positive, because in society, in terms of social views, being multilingual might be seen as just lacking competence in another language, but then in the workforce, people might be employed or paid more for speaking a minoritized language. So I think these 3 articles really sums up the idea of what I wanted to cover in my project. The overall logistics of this project was, I asked about 16 questions. It was about 30 minutes long, and I decided to, in the 16 questions, I asked questions about her social life, who an artist she listened to, such as just more Spanish music, that you listen to. I asked about friendships, clubs at UCSB, so many things, but I decided that in terms of narrowing down, I couldn't just fit all the questions into this project. I would focus on a big idea and a small idea, and my big idea was like the United States and like how she saw her language was being treated in the United States, and my small idea was just personal, like how she felt she was being treated as a person in the United States, or how she felt about her language. I just thought dealing with these questions, specifically big and small ideas, better fits the question of linguistic identity rather than, I believe the other questions I asked were relevant, but they weren't as specific enough for my project, and the questions I decided to pick for this, I believe were the right choice. So some of the information about the participant was that her name is Leslie Lopez. She's a sociology major at UCSB. She is Mexican, and she really seems to be really in touch with the culture. And I knew this because she's my roommate, and we've talked about several issues in the United States, and she speaks Spanish to her family, usually on the phone, and she's always like, oh, I don't know Spanish that well, but as someone who doesn't know Spanish at all, I'm just like, you sound pretty fluent to me. So I just feel like she's really in touch with that. She seems to really love her culture. I decided to shorten it as LL. I don't, just for transcript purposes, but I would only be using small excerpts and quotation marks, so I don't think the shortened form is really relevant here. But we'll talk about struggles and like just our cultural law as we're roommates and we're minorities in the United States, and I think we really used that to bond, and I think that made this interview process much more smoother and much more easier for us. And some of the metadata about my project was that it was conducted on May 23rd, 2022. It was about 8 a.m. We were getting ready to go to class, and I was like, I need to interview you about this. We've been planning it for a while, but being busy students, it was really just, it happened at 8 a.m. It happened at our apartment, and I was present, and also Leslie herself was present. In terms of recording, I just used my phone, the iPhone 12 Pro Max, and I used an app on my phone because I'm really familiar with that, and I thought that would be the best way to just record the conversation. And since we both woken up, we weren't looking the best, and I think she was more comfortable with just recording rather than a video recording conversation. I wrote down my questions on a Google Doc, and I just read them out while we were having our conversation and interview, the specific questions after each break. So the first topic that I focused on was bilingualism. This was one of the big topic. I just wanted to know how she viewed her strength as someone who's bilingual, economically. How does she think her language is viewed in the economy of the United States? So the question here was, how is bilingualism seen in the United States and for the economy? And the question I asked her, given that I wrote a couple of questions down, I asked her was, in general, how do you think multilingualism or bilingualism is taken in the United States, socially and economically? And her response was something like, in the workplace, it's seen as a very good thing. And now as an adult, I'm people are oh, you talk Spanish too. Essentially just saying that it's seen as a good thing in the workplace. This could be most hires maybe giving a pay raise for speaking multiple languages. And this relates to my research question because I wanted to see how she performs her identity in the workplace economically. How is bilingualism seen in that location. And for literature, this was somewhat related to Land's two-way integration of migrants and minoritized speakers, talking about like how multilingualism can be seen as a deficit or resource depending on the situation. So this is a paper, a sort of summary of it, how it could be seen as a deficit or a resource. And she talked about how in the workplace this is seen as a resource, as a good thing. So I think as an overall, I like for my research question, like how did she perform her Spanish identity, it would be like she sees this as a positive and as something that comes with like positive resources. And in terms of bilingualism, also I wanted to ask about socially, like how does she think bilingualism is seen in the social world, like how she treated because of this, and how does she view herself because of this. And the specific question I asked her was like, in general, like how do you think multilingualism is like seen in the workplace? Just like how are you treated because of this, and like things like that. And I was like more focusing on, like what do you think the positives and the negatives are? Like how do you think people treat you? And she brought up the topic of racism, like, we're all in America, like speak American, like talk American, talk English. And, this is important. Like if she also saw it, like, they're always saying talk English, whether someone's speaking Spanish or Chinese. And I think this is a important point because, as we can see in the two-way integration of migrants, they, that's the deficit that it's been seen as. Like that's you need to speak English. Like in the social world, it's like, okay, you need to speak English. Like you're here in America. And in the economic world and the workforce, it's like, oh, like we're gonna pay you more if you can speak Spanish, or we can get more customers. So it's only appreciated when it's seen as a positive. So in terms of intercultural communication, we can learn that language shouldn't be only appreciated when it's used to benefit ourselves, but rather when it's used for just overall, like when it's used, it should always be appreciated, because it's not just a means of communication or a means of gaining resources. It's just a way of life in general. This answers my research question, because this, knowing that her language can be seen as a deficit, could lead to her maybe not speaking her language more frequently or other things like that. This sort of leads to my next topic, which is about race. And in terms of racial identity, the question that I asked her was, are there times where you feel uncomfortable speaking Spanish in public? Like, are you scared of being racially profiled? And, she said, what, in high school, a lot of people associated like speaking Spanish or speaking like in her language as ghetto. And I think, this really brings how not just like just the way of like speaking could be seen as negative. And I just want to know how she was treated because of this. And overall, just like social remarks like that can really have an impact on how one views their self and how one views their language. And she ended up telling me like she didn't feel this way anymore, but in high school was really a big deal for her, because she didn't want to be viewed in the quote mark ghetto. She didn't want to be viewed as ghetto. And this obviously impacts the way she performs her linguistic identity, because she doesn't want to be seen in a negative light. She doesn't want to perform her linguistic identity because of the negative aspects that come with it. And for in terms of literature for this, we can point to Linguistic Assertiveness to Contest Minoritization by Velma, and talk about how it was talked about how people switch from, the minoritized language to the dominant language to avoid, just being misunderstood, or just like being seen in a different light. And this could lead to why she just felt really insecure in speaking her language. And in intercultural communication, we can get to understand that in terms of communicating, we shouldn't just think that speaking one language is the right way, but rather understand that people could speak multiple languages and also be as competent as everyone else. In terms of my research question, how does she perform this? Knowing that there are negative aspects being associated with the language she speaks, it might impact her negatively in how she performs her identity in the United States. I also wanted to bring up the topic for race, exoticism. Exoticism essentially is just being exoticized, I just wanted what she thought of the stereotypes that are so associated with her language, and how does it hurt authenticity and things like that. I was asking, what do you think the attitudes towards Spanish speakers are? Are they positive, or negative, or are they exoticized? And she talk about how a lot of these attitudes are filled with stereotypes. She brought up how Taco Bell was, even though Taco Bell isn't a authentic Mexican restaurant, it tends to exoticize the language, the Spanish language, and by doing this they can attract more customers, because the customers are gonna be oh my god, they're speaking in a Spanish accent, or they're doing this Spanish, so it must be authentic. But this really isn't even helping the community. It's just the way they think it is. The literature I thought about this question from was Language Inequality and Culturality by Thorlo, which brought up the point of language being used as an instrument. And essentially, I remember there was an excerpt from that where the locals speaking their language was put on the TV, and so that people who were touring the area would see that as a reason to go. In terms of ICC, this is important because really language isn't something to be exoticized in such a way. If really you're planning on attracting customers just because by speaking a language that really isn't related to the food you make, you're only doing it to exoticize the language and gain profit from it, then that's not really positive, because it diminishes the value of the language. And this could also lead to her not just viewing her language as just an instrument or just a commodity that people could use to gain money and stuff. In terms of concluding my project, how does this link to literature? All of the literatures I have used helped in coming up with these questions. I think they bring up a lot of ideas, a lot of things like minoritization, things like exoticism. These are all important in the study of ICC, and these are things that shouldn't be taken for granted. I think using talking about exoticism really makes us understand that language isn't just something you use to gain profit, or talking about minoritization, language isn't just something that you use only if it benefits you, and then you hate when it doesn't benefit you, or when it makes you uncomfortable, or overall language is just a way. It's just something. It's just someone's culture. It's just not just a way to get money. I think overall this project like the participant herself, being someone who just enjoys her culture a lot. I know how much is taken from her high school days where her language is seen as, ghetto, to now where she is able to speak it in front of others. I think obviously that takes a lot of work, and I think she understands how her language is viewed in society and how she performs that herself, and the positives and the negative that are associated with it, and so on. In terms of intercultural communication, I think this is also important because understanding why people are treated negatively for their language helps us not do those things and have more positive attitudes towards others. And that was pretty much my project, talking about performing one's linguistic identity in the United States. And that's it.